So for those of you who don't like to be recorded, now's the time that you could flee. Anyway, thank you, Nick, for coming today and talking about your book and all the research you've done and all the other projects you're working on. I, as we discussed, like to let you introduce yourself, but I'll turn it over to you. So,
Okay, yeah, thanks, David, and thanks to everyone for coming. I am planning basically a kind of rapid stump speech on the book, high-level overview of some of the themes and ideas and case studies, and then, within 15 or 20 minutes, that'll be over, and we can have more of a conversation. Um, I have spent the last several years covering a kind of policy and economics beat, mostly for the New Yorker. And, I like the term political economy, which is a sort of self-consciously archaic sounding description of what the discipline of economics used to be called. So sometimes I like to say that I cover the political economy beat because I think almost no other journalist in America would describe what they do that way. Um, so for what it's worth, I am definitely interested in kind of well-being more broadly, but maybe during the Q&A we can kind of get into some of the details about what that means and about how it relates to economics. So, the basic kind of argument of my book is that the field of economics has kind of misunderstood itself by analogy to the natural sciences, and that there's a very common maneuver whereby economics presents itself as a study of a kind of realm that is governed by discoverable natural laws in the same way that one might study physics or chemistry. One can study economics, discern these laws, and then kind of simply describe them. The first part of the book kind of traces the evolution of this model of economics all the way back to the origins of the discipline in political economy. People like David Ricardo in the early 1800s evoke an analogy to the law of gravitation while he's opposing poverty relief for the English poor. Fast forward a century, and William Graham Sumner does a similar thing during the antitrust era in America. He evokes the law of gravitation and says anyone who opposes increasing corporate concentration of power is sort of as foolish as a critic of gravitation, in effect, because this is an inevitable law-like process. Go into the 20th century and the examples come fast and thick. Milton Friedman is a big part of this story, but it actually is a maneuver that's present across a broad range of economists on all points on an ideological spectrum, I think. And so, in the first chapter of the book, I kind of talk about the history of economics education, the history of the field, and then I get inside a current effort to broaden, or sometimes it's described as pluralize economics. So having a plurality of views and approaches. Heterodox economics is another kind of buzzword in these circles. And the goal of people trying to reform economics education that I write about in the first chapter is kind of to restore some of the components of this older tradition of political economy where historical contingency, but also moral and political dimensions of economic choices are much more foregrounded. So you're not so much discerning natural laws as you're making sort of complicated assessments of different choices that have a kind of inescapable ethical dimension. And you can imagine, how this would reshape a lot of public conversation in the media if more people were educated on this view. I mean, everything from how labor markets and interest rates and wages are covered to sort of the way taxation works, the way stock markets and private equity function. All of this would be described in much more, I think, evaluative and ethical terms rather than sort of simply reporting on what's happening as if the basic parameters of the system are unchangeable. So in a way, the rest of the book is all sort of downstream from academia on purpose, because the argument is that if people changed their early indoctrination through the way they studied economics, and if they broadened it to include politics and ethics and history, we might have a very different economic system. I'm attracted in this context to the kind of quote that's famous from Paul Samuelson, who wrote one of the best-selling economics books in the 20th century. I mean, I find the quote very sinister, but I'm attracted to it because it encapsulates this view. And he said near the end of his career, "I don't care who writes a nation's laws if I can write its economics textbooks." Um, so he was very aware of his influence as a shaper of cultural common sense. And I think expanding what counts as economics is a sort of basic prerequisite for some of the other changes that the book explores and kind of argues for. So just to move on to some of those and preview slash survey them briefly. One of them is the employee ownership model, which actually Samuelson himself on 60 Minutes, so on national television in the 1970s, he was asked about what at the time were known as Kelso plans. Today we call them ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans. And very dismissively, his response to the journalist when he was asked about these plans was, "Yeah, and it would also be nice if lollipops grew on trees." So again, you can see the sort of the invoking of a natural law analogy, as if this would violate a basic law of the universe if we let workers have some capital ownership in the businesses where they worked. Um, in fact, many millions of lollipops have since grown on trees. In recent years, I think the most recent data show about 14 million Americans with ESOP plans. So, the question isn't whether or not Samuelson was correct. It's more that his influence, to what extent did that prevent a broader adoption of the model? I mean, I think clearly he's not right that this violates a fundamental law of economics or of the universe, but it is interesting to think about the counterfactual in which he had not exercised that influence, and more broadly, many other economists had not sort of functioned to constrict the space of imaginative possibilities for how a business could be organized. So, in the chapters on employee ownership, I explore various models. One is a case study on Mondragon in Spain, which is one of the world's largest worker-owned cooperatives. It's a federation of co-ops. They all have a basic structure in common, although they span many industries, everything from industrial manufacturing to more sort of service-oriented sectors like banks, grocery stores, to fundamental research. They have an entire R&D co-op. So the unifying feature across all of the Mondragon co-ops, well, really there are two features. One is a ratio of 6-to-1. This is a cap on the highest to lowest employee salary, so you can never have the top person making more than 6x the lowest person. Second basic feature is democracy. So there's a one member, one vote policy at Mondragon, and they vote on quite consequential decisions, things like strategic acquisitions, whether to, during a global pandemic, for instance, whether to decrease their hours in order to accumulate some kind of strategic buffer or reserve. These are democratically taken decisions, and the pay ratio itself is subject to some level of democratic approval. So in theory, it could drift higher than 6-to-1. And in fact, earlier in the history of Mondragon, it was 3-to-1. And so some people within the co-ops kind of like to see this as a sign of striking moral decline over the decades. Then again, to an American, if you compare 6-to-1 to 350-to-1, it seems like there's still the decline has not progressed too far. So switching over, from this European model of worker ownership to various American examples, I talk in another chapter about purpose trusts, where retiring but also younger business owners turn over the ownership of their business to a legal trust, which can then stipulate a purpose. Typically, this tends to be something pro-social, like quarterly distribution of profit to employees or to nonprofits that support some kind of environmental cause. One person up in my neighborhood, so I live in Berkeley, and there's a bakery in Oakland that has as part of its purpose that they will hire preferentially folks who were formerly incarcerated or homeless. And so, for all of the people in that chapter, there's a kind of basic dilemma that they see the purpose trust as solving. For people retiring, the concern is what will happen after I'm gone if there are new owners who don't necessarily share my values. The trust is a way to preserve the legacy of the founder in perpetuity. I mean, they're sometimes called perpetual purpose trusts. Patagonia is a famous recent example. For the younger bakery owner up here in Oakland, his concern was a little bit more linked to financing. He needed money to expand, and many of the traditional sources of venture capital, he was concerned that they would not share his basic social mission of hiring formerly homeless or incarcerated people. And so he needed funding that did not have strings attached. So one way to ensure that these investors, if the bakery began losing money, could not just jettison the entire social mission of the bakery was to have this purpose trust in place. So employee ownership, this is kind of one aspect of a more sustainable economy. And I mean, one of the more striking statistics that I think sort of makes the case for employee ownership comes from a basic comparison where if you look at the ownership shares that workers at Sears department stores had in the 1950s, and then you gave that same level of ownership to Amazon workers today. Well, actually, no, this is not today. This is in 2018. Today, it would be even more dramatic. But the comparison was from 2018. So take Sears in the 1950s, sort of basic one-stop everything shop in America. Then take Amazon, similar thing today, arguably much more one stop in nature, but give the workers the same amount of equity in Amazon in 2018 as the Sears folks had in the 1950s. The average net worth of the Amazon workers in 2018 would have been close to $400,000. Since then, stock price has more than doubled. So you can imagine, if everyone driving, delivering, working in warehouses, if all of those folks at Amazon, over 1 million employees, had assets worth close to $1 million. I mean, this does start to get close to the much discussed but rarely specified how goal of achieving an American middle class again, right? So I think worker ownership is a powerful model. Happy to talk more about that and some of the legislative incentives that might turbocharge that. A few other quick things that I'll sort of skate through from the book. One involves the sort of often, I think, lazily thrown about term living wages. So I get into the history of that term, which, in America goes back to Teddy Roosevelt, Samuel Gompers, a Catholic priest, John Ryan. All of these folks in the early 20th century had a much broader conception of what a living wage should enable. In fact, if you make a living wage, they argue, you should be able to save a bit for retirement, save something for your kids' education, save for a rainy day. Life happens, things go wrong, things break, but also be able to enjoy some level of leisure time. You should be able to go out and enjoy yourself in your spare time. Look at what the living wage movement today actually enables, and it's incredibly constricted relative to that earlier definition. I think it's more accurate to describe it as a not quite dying wage. People over and over again write to the woman at MIT who maintains the most influential living wage calculator in America, and they say, I cannot live on what you're calling a living wage. So either the term is misleading and should be adjusted, or if we're going to keep the term, it just needs to include much more. So there's, you can see how this kind of fits into the first point I was making about the moral and political dimensions of economics. You can do a brilliant job calculating the cost of housing and food and childcare on a county by county basis around America. And then you can feed that into a calculator and it can spit out a living wage. But if you haven't first had a kind of ethically informed conversation about what counts as living, the calculator, I think, very easily becomes sort of a tool of corporate branding, right? Where companies can claim to be paying a living wage when in fact, what that wage really enables is incredibly paltry, and folks are struggling tremendously and often having to go rely on various government assistance programs. So a few other things, and I won't go too far into any of these, but the book kind of leaps back and forth between Europe and America, looking at compelling case studies of economic alternatives. And I should say that even though the title of the book is How to Build a Just Economy, authors don't always, choose the titles or the subtitles completely. They have some input. I think it's a little hubristic, a little ambitious. I don't think that even if all of the initiatives in the book were realized, we would necessarily have a just economy, but I think we would be closer. And so, in that sort of spirit, the book tries to just look at compelling case studies that would get us some degree closer. It's not, the sensibility is not so much here is the single magic bullet that will get us all the way there. It's like, here is a compelling portfolio of interventions which all exist in the world. So they are resistant to the charge of utopianism. They actually are being implemented already at some scale. And then they also are, I think, able to be combined almost in a plug and play model in intriguing ways. So if you think about job guarantees, which is another chapter where I look at an experiment outside of Vienna, Austria, where any long-term unemployed person who is interested in joining the job guarantee is eligible, but none of them are compelled to join. So this distinguishes it from the kind of compulsory workfare model that many other countries use. People want to join generally. I mean, everyone who was given the choice, all of the long-term unemployed folks in this town in Austria wanted to join. And one reason they wanted to was that they got considerable input into the work they were doing. So they were matched with a social worker. They got to co-design the jobs they would do. And this sort of basic premise was, what are the things the community needs and what are the things that you're good at? What's the overlap of those two sets? And then let's sort of make that happen. The program itself costs just less than what the Austrian state was already spending on unemployment benefits. This is, an intentional design feature. They're trying to preempt the objection of we can't afford this. More broadly, though, kind of as an intervention in labor markets, I mean, this sort of connects to our example of Amazon earlier. If you had a very attractive public option for work, it's hard to imagine a lot of people given the choice between low wage work, often in a kind of surveillance environment characterized by union busting, and sort of attractive, higher paid work that they've co-designed with a social worker. I think you can imagine how this would immediately put upward pressure on low road private sector employers. So a job guarantee, it's kind of partly an intervention on the kind of the psychological effects of long-term unemployment, which can be devastating, but I think it also has potential as an intervention in labor markets. Um, you know, I'm just going to kind of end with a quick laundry list of other things in the book, and then maybe to the extent that any of these are interesting, we can plunge into them further. So I don't want to talk for too long, but a few of the other chapters get into the true price movement, which is trying to get unpriced external effects of goods priced back into those goods. Happy to talk more about that. There's a chapter on the idea of a public option for irregular work or gig workers. This is being piloted at a municipal level at a few cities in America have a version of this that they're trying. There are chapters on participatory budgeting and climate budgeting. So how do cities spend their money? Who gets to spend that money? I think some of those implications are very interesting in a campaign season where you actually can kind of, for all the rhetoric about democracy, it's quite rare to find direct democratic power combined with real money in the hands of citizens. And so I think participatory budgeting is very compelling in that way. And then there's even a chapter that touches on private equity and more broadly sort of explores how flows of investment capital are important to mobilizing both climate goals, but also potentially, depending on how the model's executed, giving more capital to workers at the lower ends of an income spectrum. So yeah, I mean, maybe I'll pause there and
Yeah.
happy to talk more about any of these details or other things that I might be useful on.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nick, and appreciate all the work you've been doing all these years to investigate all this and dig it up and put it together. I'd like to start with one question, then I'll turn it out to other people. Just go ahead and either raise your physical hand or your Zoom hand if you want. And then just going to ask that people keep it to an actual question and not, so much promoting a specific effort that they're working on and so forth. But since Nick has been kind enough to give us some time, want to make sure we stick with and just so we can have as many people ask, just try and keep it to one question and not a multi-part question, if you don't mind. That'd be great. My question is, given the two countervailing forces, you've got all these different things that you're documenting that are positive, trying to achieve things, and then the things that are trying to keep it status quo or worse. What sort of gives you hope at this point to see more positive progress?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question.
Of course, I asked it.
Yeah, I mean I don't know how much hope I actually have.
That's
Not
fair.
yeah, I guess I definitely am not sort of in the crystal ball business of saying like within 5 years these things will happen and you heard it here first. That being said, I mean to try to take your question more seriously, I guess, you know, these are all things I'm sure most folks are already aware of, but the level of support for unions in public opinion polls, I think, is an encouraging sign. Um, I think there's more and more recognition of a kind of disconnect between the kind of macroeconomic policy discussion and people's lived experience of the economy. To some extent, this shows up in frustration with things like GDP, right? I mean, you read any newspaper or even turn on NPR, which I think still fashions itself as progressive. There's just constant attention to how much economic growth have we had? What are markets doing this week? And there's no attention to the distributional aspect of GDP. So there are actually some economists here at UC Berkeley that have a statistical tool that lets you see in real time or close to real time. There's some lag to the data, but say that there's 4% growth in GDP. Okay, that's nice. But what if we knew by decile of the income distribution how that growth was distributed? Well, if all of the 4% is accruing to the top 20%, I'm making this up, but you sort of see the intuition here is that our statistics are often kind of imprisoning us within a certain ideological way of looking at the world. And so better statistics could be helpful. But, I think a lot of the kind of just baseline disaffection with politics and economics in the sense that elites are corrupt, whatever their political party, stems from this. So some of these basic schisms where, I'm hearing X, but I'm experiencing Y. I know that like these things do not match, and so my sort of my default option is just like, well, the experts are lying. I don't trust any of them, and so I don't know that this is actually cause for hope, but I guess what I'm saying is that one could interpret kind of broad and widespread like disaffection with economic and policy elites as recognition of the failure of kind of conventional neoclassical macroeconomics.
Fair enough. Thank you. Joe, would you like to come off mute and
Thank you, David, and thank you for the wonderful research you've been doing and so forth. I certainly agree that equity considerations is fundamental, but that's not the question, and it's worth a discussion, but that's not the question I'd like to focus on. The EPA set the price of the social cost of carbon, that is the damage each additional ton of emitted carbon causes, at $190. Denial, I would say greed and right-wing pushback reduced the cost to around $50. A recent scientific report said it should be $1,056 per ton. Given that we're emitting 41 gigatons this year, the cost at the higher rate to deal with cleaning up the emissions from this year alone would be $41 trillion. And even at the EPA rates, it's still 8 trillion. Given the mess that we're leaving our children and grandchildren, I think this seems to me to be an insurmountable challenge that economics and the science world isn't really addressing meaningfully. And I would just make one other observation. If everyone in the world lived the way we do in the US, we would need 5 planets worth of resources. We're living on borrowed time. Imagine a bank account and you put in some amount each month and you take out 5 times that amount each month. It won't be too many more months before you're going to be in pretty desperate financial shape. That's what we're doing to our planet. How can economics help us address these really meaningful big issues? You mentioned climate. Absolutely. This is the climate economic problem that we're refusing to look at. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you, Joe. I think those are excellent points. You know, the closest I sort of get to discussing those is the second chapter of the book on true price. And true price is a sort of framework for accounting and bookkeeping. And it sounds a little sort of technical and dry, but it's getting at exactly the concerns you're articulating. And in fact, it's sort of adding additional ones. So not only are we emitting too much carbon, we're also eroding or degrading soil quality. We are poisoning all kinds of species across many ecosystems. You know, beyond ecological concerns, our supply chains often have forced labor throughout them. And this is the case increasingly even in America. There are underage workers for household brands. Go to any grocery store and walk down the aisles. There were underage children likely involved in the production of those goods. I mean, like Hannah Dreier at the Times got a Pulitzer Prize for this reporting. So I agree with what you're saying, and I think the kind of expanded version of what you're saying is that there are all of these unpriced externalities to our current economic system. And if more of those were included into the price mechanism, people would change their behavior. Taxes and subsidies are a kind of natural way to do that. You know, true pricing has various manifestations. There's a kind of consumer-facing model, which I'm actually less optimistic about. Then there's the use of it as a kind of supply chain auditing tool. And this, I think, has more promise and maybe behind some of the like proposals for supply chain due diligence legislation in the EU and elsewhere. And then, you know, I think the maximum sort of expression of this policy would be just as a tool of regulation and legislation, so that if we took seriously these costs, like the ones you're mentioning, we might not, I mean, you could hypothetically sort of still leave it to markets and say, do we want to, are there any takers, right? This economic activity now costs whatever insane number of trillions you mentioned. Who's still going to do it? I mean, probably no one. But if you go back in time, like you mentioned the EPA, I don't think we would want to just rely on the price signal to achieve environmental outcomes. Sometimes you simply need categorical bans, right? You want a ban on enforced child labor in supply chains. You want a ban on certain toxic chemicals, like forever chemicals, right? That would have been nice 40, 50 years ago. If
Fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels, absolutely, right? And so, I think true pricing is a powerful framework, partly for consciousness raising, so that it can then feed into legislation and regulation, which I think it's a necessary complement that we also just need some categorical bans. We don't just want to say, well, what's the true price of the lost childhood of someone who was forced into work at age 10? Like, some things should not be placed within that market context, I think, on moral grounds. But yeah, I mean, I totally take your point, and I think I share a lot of your concerns.
Yeah. Thank you. Jim, welcome. Glad you could join. I think this is your first time here since we just met recently. Would you like to come off mute and ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, David. Great presentation, Nick. This is interesting on a variety of levels to hear. I've been involved with the American experiment on I guess, professional level for almost 6 decades now, closer to 5, I guess. And the thing that concerns me the most given this experience is that our public has a lack of clear understanding as to our democracy, capitalism character. And in that context, a lot of the things that you're talking about find themselves relevant. But I go back to that, my initial concern there. It's difficult for people to talk about capitalism in America and all the elements and the economic, political, and social features of capitalism. So I'm wondering what you think about that point. Do you think that our public, our citizenry is equipped enough to sort of grasp these kinds of things that you're talking about without having a more broader understanding of what capitalism actually is and how it sort of interfaces with democracy and profit versus public good and cooperation versus competition and the me and we kind of ideas. So I'm just putting that out there to you to see what your reaction is. Do you think the public can understand what you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I guess I think of the public less as a kind of static, unchanging entity and more as like the outcome of some sort of complex feedback loop between, the educational system, the media, home environment, certainly social media these days. And so there's a lot to worry about. And I think depending on one's inclination, it's not too hard to kind of cite evidence for doom or, I mean, there's some evidence for optimism too. But I guess my answer is a bit of a cop-out, which is kind of maybe, and it depends on how people are educated. I mean, one thing that's kind of interesting, folks here are probably familiar with this idea of citizens' assemblies. So these have been used in the last decade or so, but in some sense, they go all the way back to ancient Athens. And they're just this kind of direct democratic model where people are chosen by lot, so randomly, but to be representative of a broader population distribution based on census data. So, you get some normal people together the same way you do for something like jury duty, and then you let them deliberate on complicated questions, right? Like it could be whether assisted suicide laws need revision. It could be something on climate change. I mean, it could be There's one that's coming up actually in Oregon on the question of youth homelessness. So the people who run some of the nonprofits and some of the researchers who've studied this, I mean, as far as I understand it, their answer too, right? Because they have this sort of operationalized model that's asking your question, like, can we trust people to make good decisions and to think reasonably? And their answer also seems to be kind of like, maybe, but you have to set things up in the right way. Like, you have to give people enough time. That's one thing, is not rushing them through the deliberation. Another is like, ground rules do seem to matter. How we speak to each other, who we hear from, of course, really matters. Having a broad range of expert testimony on the topic, and then giving people some sense that their voice will actually have an impact. So when the outcomes of citizens' assemblies are binding, that also seems important, right? It becomes less of just a kind of cosmetic display, like, oh yeah, you can have your voice, but like, we, the legislators, are going to actually decide what to do because we don't trust you. I think in the book, the participatory budgeting chapter kind of gets into some of these same questions, where you just take people and then you give them access to hundreds of thousands of dollars if they win a public election, and you sort of see, well, how would you like your city to be different, right? What are the things you're interested in changing? And you let anyone from middle schoolers to senior citizens participate in this process. It's quite encouraging, honestly. Like, I spent some time in this town outside Lisbon watching the PB process, and when it's well executed, you do have a sense that direct democracy is a plausible model of human governance. Now, one can always cherry pick other examples where things don't seem to go so well, and you actually wouldn't want something left up to a popular vote. So I realize that's a little bit of an evasive answer, but I don't have a kind of categorical fundamentalist yes or no. I think it's like, to some extent, when it's set up right and when people are given like the time and the education to do a good job.
Thank you, Nick. Sandra,
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
we sure can.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, that was a perfect segue because you mentioned education. I won't get into it, but I do have a question. You speak about a lived economy and a living wage, and also we are a consumer economy. I mean, the way the dollar turns in this country is regular people buy things. And so my question is about the field of economics in general. And while I realize it has gotten more humanistic in the past, let's say 10 years, they don't seem to ever focus on the economics of the home, also known as home economics, which I realize comes with lots of gender baggage. That's unfortunate because somehow or other we all made it to adulthood having eaten, been sheltered, and clothed with that knowledge. So I don't understand how we can move forward as a fair democracy, capitalistic, without including what happens in the home for the first 18 years of our life, and how we get more money into the hands of consumers.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I totally agree with you. I think one line of criticism of GDP makes that exact argument, that there's all of this economic activity that takes place within households and that is actually entirely upstream of later economic activity, right? Like, without that work, no one is doing anything else in the economy. It's absolutely fundamental. And so for all of that to somehow just be unpriced or ignored is strange. And I think there's a broader critique about the undervaluing of the care sector that, some people, especially sort of post-growth and degrowth economists, make this argument where if you think that the best measure of well-being or flourishing is actually health, and sort of including the psychological dimensions of health, then health rather than wealth is like, that's the fundamental goal of an economy, is to provide that. And if that's the case, then care work starts to seem much, much more important than the production and consumption of consumer products, right? So, I mean, I think that's a very persuasive argument. Julie Nelson, who's a wonderful economist, she's often described as a feminist economist. She observes that, in America, you can make more money watching parked cars than you can watching children, right? And if you just look at census data for different occupations, this is easily verifiable, and it's kind of a horrifying reflection of an economic system with the values that we're describing. So,
And note that Claudia Golden's recent Nobel is certainly testimony.
Totally, yeah.
Christian.
Hi, Nick. Thank you for your really interesting presentation. Look forward to reading the book. I was thinking about these initiatives that you talk about that are Mondragon, and this work guarantee where you work with a social worker to kind of find the right fit job. Some really extraordinary initiatives that exist, and I'm wondering about kind of the places, like the societies in which these kind of initiatives are popping up, and what are the characteristics of these societies as compared to the United States. So some things that come to mind, I think of a place, we think of Sweden as a socialist democracy, or we think of these countries that have some progressive laws, and they tend to be homogenous. Also the United States, we have the biggest budget for military. So is it, how much is it because they can afford it? How much is it because they're homogenous? Is it culturally that some countries are more, or some cultures are more extroverted and just have an easier time cooperating with others? So yeah, that's what I'm wondering about, and be really curious to hear your insight on it.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. When I was reporting in Mondragon, which is in the Basque region, northern Spain, beautiful part of the country, this was sort of a popular thing to debate, actually. People there sort of would go back and forth on, like, why does this model work, right? Is it something about the people here, right? Like one view is that there's something kind of unique about the region or the people. I mean, the Basque people have a separate language. Many of them would like to have a separate governance structure from Spain. Is there just something unique about Basque country in Spain? Another view is that no, in fact, they're just people, and therefore the model is exportable because they are people who interact with these institutions, and it's actually the institutional design that enables the model to work. I think with a lot of these debates, it's not the most satisfying answer, but like the truth is somewhere in the middle. There's some kind of complex feedback loop between culture and institutions, and the history of a region does matter, but I don't think is totally deterministic of how that region, like sort of creates an economy. I mean, so I hesitate to even call him the CEO, but the person who is the president of all of Mondragon, he likes to say, and he's actually quoting the founder of Mondragon, he likes to say, you can't have cooperatives without cooperative people, right? Which, like, I mean, if you do have a one worker, one vote policy, and everyone actually behaves in an entirely self-interested way with no sense of solidarity, like they would just vote to get rid of all the co-ops. And so he's right on one level, but then how do you get to cooperative people? Well, I think like it's it's interesting that in Mondragon there are co-op schools, right? And like if you spend time in some of those schools, like the teachers will just quite explicitly say like, yeah, we're trying to raise cooperative humans. We want to teach them like a way of being such that they are other regarding rather than just self-regarding, that they kind of understand um, solidarity and like long-term rather than short-term gratification. I mean, all the things that one might hope for from education are kind of quite explicitly like on the agenda. So, I guess to zoom out a little bit just from one corner of Spain, I do think if you try to get a model like Mondragon off the ground in America, I mean, people have tried this, right? There are the evergreen co-ops in Ohio. There's the Industrial Commons Project. Arguably, a lot of the ESOP movement is inspired by something similar, especially when it's combined with kind of open book management or worker voice and sort of democratic one worker, one vote policies. There is a more individualistic flavor in America, which I think reflects our history and our culture, where, like the employee stock ownership plan is not really the same as a worker-owned co-op where the salary cap is 6-1 and where you vote on every decision. So the number of ESOPs that actually approximate all of those elements in Mondragon, I think, would be quite small. There are some, but they are not kind of federated in a Mondragon style superorganism with 80,000 workers and $12 billion in annual turnover. Does that mean it could never happen in America? I mean, I don't know. It might take some time, I guess, would be my answer, which is maybe a cop-out.
Um, I'm
Just thank you so much.
I'm going to go ahead and cheat and ask two questions. But the first one's very short. You mentioned your fellow professors at Berkeley, and I'm specifically thinking of Gabriel Zuckman. Pardon me for butchering the pronunciation of his name, but he's proposing a worldwide millionaires or billionaires wealth tax. Think there's any likelihood that that could actually get adopted, and any cons to it perhaps, or is it all great if we can make it happen?
I would support it. I think it's a very reasonable policy and in fact quite modest in the percentage being proposed. As to sort of feasibility, I think these things are a little bit hard to predict, but it does seem encouraging that, in the last last decade or so, that there has been some movement on international tax conventions, trying to set global minima, even things like ultimate beneficial ownership registries have been pretty consequential so that you can figure out who owns a company, cracking down on tax havens. I think there's more and more appetite for this. And, a lot of people even point out that like employees at the IRS, and this is true around the world, like they pay for themselves, right? It's not like we can't afford to fund these agencies because they bring in many, many times more than it costs to have a skilled inspector like tracking down unpaid taxes. So, I guess I don't have anything super original on this point, except that I think it's a good idea and that the momentum seems generally positive.
That's great. So my second question is somewhat related. You started us off by quoting a villain, I can't remember his exact name, talking about controlling economics textbooks, and you talked about different economics professors throughout the hour. Do you see a lot of change going on in the economics textbooks that are being produced? Is that an opportunity for change, or like a ripe opportunity for change, or is it already underway?
The most widely adopted challenger textbook is this open source project called Core Curricular Open Access Resources in Economics. It's a free textbook. It has much more attention to issues like climate change, wealth inequality, history, human psychology is presented in a more nuanced way. Even the kind of efficiency of markets and the relative rareness of market failure, those assumptions are questioned, like market failure is presented as much more pervasive. So I think, some people have said core doesn't go far enough. I think it's definitely an improvement on things like Gregory Mankiw's book or Paul Samuelson's book, or most of the major things that are still common in Econ 101 classes. Core is now pretty widespread. I mean, it's taught at community colleges, it's taught at Ivy League schools. In the UK, something like 45 out of 60 something undergraduate programs in econ now use core. It has movements and supporters around the world, contributors from around the world. So I'm actually pretty optimistic about how some of the econ textbooks are changing. I mean, I still think that it's important for econ students to aspire, and for professors to aspire to something more like the John Maynard Keynes model. Keynes famously said the master economist has 4 components. He must be, to some degree, mathematician, philosopher, statesman, and historian. I think a kind of quick way to describe what happens in the second part of the 20th century, especially, is like 3 of those 4 things go away, and there's just a lot of very skilled mathematicians. And, they can come to some very interesting insights, but when they're deprived from this broader context, it's a little scary how they get used.
Thank you. I've not heard of that, so that's very encouraging. So, Joe, I'm going to let you ask the last question. Just we're short on time, so if you'd make it a fairly brief question, that would be helpful, since we're wrapping up.
Thank you. Let's assume that Project 2025 gets implemented. What are the economic implications for our country?
Well, I mean, they're not great, I think is my sense. I think the regulatory state is severely diminished. I mean, Chevron deference is already fairly concerning. There are, as I'm sure you know, very specific action items for all of the regulatory agencies. And, like take one example, the NLRB, which adjudicates labor disputes. The Biden appointed general counsel would be fired on day 1 of the second Trump administration. I think that's reasonable to expect. That's called for in the document. You would have, as we saw in the first Trump administration, you would have sort of management side attorneys staffing the agency that is supposed to oversee labor law. So you would have people who have spent a career union busting for fancy law firms. Many of them would then be adjudicating these disputes. So, it's very reasonable to think that would have a chilling effect on organizing. It's a little unclear, like what would happen and how bad it would be for the major legislative achievements of the Biden administration. Like I'm thinking of CHIPS, Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of the place-based investing strategy and green energy, I think might actually be pretty hard to get rid of because they're quite popular and bipartisan on the ground. So I don't know really exactly how bad that would be. I'm sure there are people who have thought more closely about that and have some empirics to support what they're saying. But yeah, I mean, generally, I think it's fairly alarming. We could have a whole conversation on trade, I'm sure. I mean, and there are some interesting points where the kind of circle meets, where you see alignment between people like Bernie Sanders and Trump, however superficial and limited. And of course, they have fundamentally different worldviews. It is interesting when, the points on the circle start to overlap. I think that is itself kind of worth reflecting on what's going on there. Yeah. But that's probably another conversation.
Yeah. So Nick, thank you so much. Appreciate the time, and the level of depth and time that you put in just is apparent in everything that you're saying. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with? Any last thoughts or questions for us? Or there's a pretty wide, diverse group, both geographically and where people are focused. But what are your last thoughts that you want to share?
Well, no, I really appreciate you having me on. I'm just typing my my email into the chat. So feel free to be in touch. I definitely am interested in kind of learning about interesting economic models and ideas. Yeah, so feel free to be in touch or drop me a line if you're ever up in Berkeley.
Awesome. Well, thank you
Okay.
so much for taking the time today and being patient as we rescheduled. So thanks everybody else for coming. Our next event is in 2 weeks, where we're gonna more just be talking amongst ourselves about how do we create a policy platform for a well-being economy alliance, and what are the top priorities that you'd like to see in such a platform. So feel free to join us for some good conversations and breakout rooms, and trying to patch things together to figure out how we can collaborate across silos, as my friend Dave Rice likes to say. So I'll